I never thought a camping trip could change everything, but then again, I never expected Finn to show up at my tent in the middle of a thunderstorm, drenched and shaking, telling me he couldn't sleep alone. That moment, with rain hammering against the nylon walls and lightning illuminating his face through the fabric, that's when I realised I'd been lying to myself for months about what I actually felt for him. We'd known each other since sophomore year of college. Finn was my roommate's friend first, always around our apartment, always making everyone laugh with these terrible puns that somehow became endearing after the 50th time you heard them. He had this way of lighting up a room, you know? Like his presence alone could shift the entire energy of a space. I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it at first. He was just Finn, just this guy who was around a lot, who I'd grown comfortable with in that easy way you do with people in your orbit. But somewhere between study sessions that turned into late-night conversations and group hangouts, where I found myself always aware of where he was in the room, something shifted. I started noticing things. The way he'd run his hand through his hair when he was concentrating on something. How his eyes crinkled at the corners when he genuinely laughed. Not just the polite chuckle he'd give to be nice. The particular shade of green his eyes turned in certain lighting. Small things that shouldn't have mattered but suddenly felt significant in a way I couldn't quite name. The camping trip was supposed to be this big group thing, 8 of us heading up to the mountains for a long weekend before finals. I almost didn't go. I'd been feeling weird around Finn lately, this nervous energy that made me second-guess everything I said around him, made me hyper-aware of every accidental touch or prolonged eye contact. I thought maybe some distance would help me figure out what was going on in my head. But then he texted me specifically, said it wouldn't be the same without me there, and I found myself saying yes before I could overthink it. The drive up was 5 hours of me trying to act normal while being intensely conscious of the fact that Finn was in the car, singing off key to the radio, his knee occasionally bumping mine when we hit rough patches of road. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. This was just Finn, my friend. Nothing had changed except whatever was happening in my own head, and I needed to get it together. We got to the campsite late afternoon, that perfect golden hour light filtering through the pine trees. The air smelled like earth and sap and coming summer. Everyone was in high spirits, joking around while we set up tents and gathered firewood. I volunteered to set up my tent on the edge of our little circle, telling myself I wanted the view of the lake, not admitting that I needed some space to breathe. Finn's tent ended up next to mine anyway. Of course it did. He asked if I wanted help with my setup and I said no too quickly, then felt bad about it and overcompensated by being extra helpful with his. We worked in this comfortable silence, the kind that felt easy and natural, and I started to relax. Maybe this would be fine. Maybe I was making a big deal out of nothing. That first night around the campfire was perfect. Someone brought a guitar, we roasted marshmallows, told stories, laughed until our sides hurt. Finn sat across from me, the firelight playing across his features, and I caught myself staring more than once. He caught me too, gave me this questioning smile, and I looked away quickly, feeling my face heat up in a way that had nothing to do with the flames. Later, in my sleeping bag, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves. I could hear Finn moving around in his tent getting settled. The wall between us was just a thin layer of nylon, and somehow that felt both too close and not close enough. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I'd never felt this way about a guy before. I'd had girlfriends, been attracted to women, never questioned any of that. But this thing with Finn, it was different, bigger. It made all those past relationships feel like I'd been going through the motions of something I thought I was supposed to feel. The second day we hiked to a waterfall, and I ended up walking next to Finn for most of it. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his family, his little sister who was applying to colleges, his dad's terrible jokes that he'd clearly inherited. I told him about my internship anxiety, my uncertainty about what came after graduation. It felt easy, natural, like we could talk forever and never run out of things to say. At one point the trail narrowed, and he put his hand on my shoulder to steady himself on some loose rocks, and the touch sent electricity through me. I stumbled, played it off as my own footing being uncertain, but I knew, God, I knew then what this was, what I'd been avoiding naming. That night the weather forecast called for storms, but they were supposed to pass north of us. We weren't worried. We stayed up late again, this time playing cards by lantern light, and I was hyper-aware of every time Finn's hand brushed mine reaching for cards, every time our eyes met across the table. He seemed different too, or maybe I was just projecting. There were these moments where he'd look at me and I couldn't read his expression, something soft and questioning that made my heart race. I went to bed around midnight, exhausted from the hike but too wired to sleep. I lay there listening to everyone else settle in, the camp growing quiet. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to thunder, distant at first, then growing closer. Rain started pattering against my tent, light at first, then heavier. I actually loved sleeping in the rain, found the sound soothing, so I burrowed deeper into my sleeping bag and smiled. Then I heard the zipper on my tent. My heart jumped into my throat. For a second, I thought maybe a raccoon had figured out how zippers worked, which would have been terrifying for entirely different reasons. But then I heard my name, whispered low and urgent. Finn. I sat up fast, fumbling for my flashlight. The beam caught him in the opening, soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, shivering. He looked miserable and vulnerable, and something in my chest cracked wide open. "What are you doing?" I asked, already reaching for him, pulling him inside. He scrambled in, dripping everywhere, and I zipped the tent shut behind him. The rain was really coming down now, hammering against the walls, and wind whipped at the trees above us. "My tent flooded," he said, teeth chattering. "I didn't stake it down right and water just poured in. Everything's soaked." I tried to wait it out, but it kept getting worse. I grabbed my towel, started helping him dry off, trying not to think about how close we were in the small space, how I could feel the heat of his body even through his wet clothes. His tent was on the other side of camp from mine. He'd passed at least 3 other tents to get here. "You could have gone to anyone's tent," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Why mine?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and in the glow of the flashlight I saw something in his expression that made me forget how to breathe. The storm raged outside, but inside my tent the world had narrowed to just us, to the way he was looking at me like he was trying to figure out if it was safe to say what he wanted to say. "I couldn't sleep alone," he said quietly. I kept thinking about, and he paused, swallowed hard. I kept thinking about you, about how I always want to be around you, how I look for you first when I walk into a room, how nothing feels quite right unless you're there. And I thought maybe I was imagining that you might feel something similar, but then today at the waterfall, the way you looked at me. I don't know, maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm about to make everything weird, but I'm in your tent in the middle of a storm because I couldn't stand being separate from you anymore. The confession hung in the air between us. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it over the rain. Every careful wall I'd been building around these feelings crumbled. I'd spent weeks trying to convince myself this was one-sided, that I was reading into things, that I needed to get over it. And here he was, drenched and shivering and brave, telling me he felt it too. "You're not wrong," I managed to say. My voice came out rough, barely audible. I've been trying not to feel this way, trying to convince myself it was just friendship or admiration or anything else. But Finn, I think about you constantly. You're the last thing on my mind before I sleep, and the first thing when I wake up. When something good happens, you're who I want to tell. When something bad happens, you're who I want to see. And it terrifies me because I've never felt this way before. Not like this. Not about anyone. He moved closer, or maybe I did. I wasn't sure. The space between us disappeared until we were inches apart. I could see drops of water on his eyelashes, could feel his breath on my face. "I've never felt this way before either," he said. "I've known for a while, longer than I wanted to admit. I kept telling myself it would pass, that it was just because we spent so much time together. But it didn't pass. It got stronger. Every time I saw you, it got harder to pretend I didn't want to be closer to you, to touch you, to tell you everything I was feeling." The tent lit up with lightning, thunder following immediately after, so loud it shook the ground. Finn flinched, and without thinking I reached for him, pulled him closer. He was still shivering from cold or nerves or both. "You need to get out of these wet clothes," I said. "You're freezing." He nodded, started peeling off his soaked shirt. I tried not to stare, failed completely. He caught me looking and smiled, this shy, uncertain smile that made him look younger, more vulnerable. I handed him my spare shirt, the dry one I'd been saving for tomorrow. He pulled it on, and it was slightly too big on him, and something about seeing him in my clothes made my chest tight. We arranged ourselves in the sleeping bag, which was definitely meant for one person, but we made it work, pressed close together in the small space. The rain continued its assault on the tent, the storm showing no signs of letting up. But inside, wrapped up together, I felt safer than I'd ever felt. We lay there facing each other so close I could count his freckles in the dim light. Neither of us seemed to know what to do next. This was new territory, unmapped and uncertain. "So what happens now?" I asked. Finn reached up, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair off my forehead. The touch was feather-light, but it sent shivers through me. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't thought past telling you. I was so terrified you'd reject me that I didn't plan for you feeling the same way." I caught his hand, held it against my cheek. His skin was still cold but warming up. "I'm scared," I told him honestly. "I don't know what I'm doing. I've never been with a guy before. I don't even know if I'm gay or bi or what label fits. All I know is that I have feelings for you that are bigger than anything I've experienced, and that terrifies me." "Me too," he said. "I've known I was attracted to guys for a while, but I never acted on it. Never told anyone. You're the first person I've ever wanted to take this risk with. The first person who felt worth the fear." We talked for hours as the storm raged outside. We talked about our fears, our hopes, what this could mean for our friendship, for our lives. We talked about coming out, about labels, about the uncertainty of it all. It felt important to say everything, to lay it all out before we crossed any lines we couldn't uncross. "What if we mess this up?" I asked at one point. "What if we try this and it ruins our friendship? What if we don't try and spend the rest of our lives wondering what if?" he countered. "I'd rather risk the hurt of trying than live with the regret of never knowing." He was right. I knew he was right. Life was too short to let fear make all the decisions. The storm eventually started to ease, the rain settling into a gentle patter. We'd grown quiet, just looking at each other, and the tension between us had shifted into something electric, anticipatory. "Can I kiss you?" Finn asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He leaned in slowly, giving me time to change my mind, to pull back. I didn't. When his lips touched mine, it was soft, tentative, questioning. I kissed him back, my hand coming up to cup his face, and felt him smile against my mouth. The kiss deepened, grew more confident, and suddenly we were holding each other tight, kissing like we'd been waiting our whole lives for this moment. Maybe we had been. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, grinning like idiots. "That was," I started. "Yeah," he finished. We kissed again and again, making up for lost time, for all the moments we'd held back. Between kisses we whispered confessions, sweet and sincere. I told him he was beautiful. He told me I made him feel brave. I told him I'd been falling for him for months. He told me he'd been gone for me since the first time I'd stayed up all night helping him study for an exam, bringing him coffee at 2 a.m. and making terrible jokes to keep him awake. Eventually exhaustion caught up with us. We settled into the sleeping bag, tangled together, his head on my chest, my arms around him. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the sound of water dripping from leaves, the fresh, clean smell of the forest after a storm. "I'm glad your tent flooded," I murmured into his hair. He laughed softly. Best, worst camping setup ever. We fell asleep like that, wrapped up in each other, and I slept better than I had in months. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the tent, warm and bright, and Finn was still there, still in my arms, watching me with this soft expression that made my heart skip. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, suddenly shy in the daylight, aware of how we must look tangled together, clearly having shared more than just tent space. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, vulnerability flickering across his face. "Not even one," I told him honestly. "You?" He shook his head, smiled, kissed me again. "Best decision I ever made, coming to your tent." We eventually had to face the others, had to emerge from my tent together and deal with the questions that would inevitably come. But lying there in the morning light, I felt ready. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. The rest of the camping trip was different. We didn't hide it, didn't announce it, just existed together in a new way. Held hands on the hike back to the waterfall, sat close by the fire that night. Our friends noticed, of course they did, but they were good about it, supportive. A couple of them admitted they'd suspected for a while, had been waiting for us to figure it out. On our last night, lying in my tent again, both of us this time by choice not necessity. Finn asked me what I wanted this to be. I told him I wanted to try, really try. I wanted to see where this could go without fear holding us back. He said he wanted the same thing. That was 6 months ago. We've been together ever since, navigating this new relationship, learning each other in deeper ways. It hasn't always been easy. Coming out to our families was hard, especially for me since I'd never questioned my sexuality before. My parents struggled at first, but they're coming around. Finn's family was more accepting, which helped. We've had moments of doubt, times when the fear crept back in, when we wondered if we were doing the right thing. But then I'll catch him looking at me across a room and I'll remember that night in the tent. Remember the feeling of finally being honest about what I wanted, and I know we made the right choice. Love isn't always convenient. It doesn't always fit into the neat boxes we think our lives should follow. Sometimes it shows up in the middle of a storm, drenched and shivering, asking if it's okay to stay. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say yes, come in, let me warm you up, let me take this risk with you. I never thought a camping trip could change everything, but it did. It changed how I see myself, how I see love, how I see my future. And it all started because Finn was brave enough to show up at my tent to tell me he couldn't sleep alone, to risk everything on the possibility that I might feel the same way. I'm so grateful he took that risk. I'm so grateful I took it too. Because this, what we have now, this is worth every moment of fear and uncertainty. This is worth everything.